Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to another Civita breakfast hosted in cooperation with the Oslo Freedom Forum. Since we're streaming this event live on the internet, let me also wish our viewers online a very warm welcome and a good morning. For over 18 months, Civita has, due to the pandemic, I have used that term many times, only live-streamed events, which we also will continue to do. But today we have also invited a small audience to be physically present here at the venue. I hope this will be the turning point regarding the pandemic. My name is Erik Løkke. I'm a fellow at Civita, and I will be your moderator today. We have titled today's meeting for Putin's assault on Russian democracy, the case of Alexey Navalny. Russia has, during Putin's presidency, evolved ever more authoritarian. Russia's leading opposition politician, Alexey Navalny, has challenged the corrupt system and accordingly encountered attempted murder and jail without due process. Why did Navalny choose to return to Russia after attempted poisoning by the FSB? And does Navalny and his allies stand a chance against Vladimir Putin? And what is their strategy and tactics? As always, we have an excellent panel. Mr. Leonid Volkov, his chief of staff to Alexey Navalny, and Karen Anna Eggen, PhD fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. And let me also say that Civita has been a partner to the Oslo Freedom Forum from the very start back in 2009, and we take great pride in being an official partner. In just a few seconds, I will end my introduction, but before I give the floor to Mr. Volkov, let me just use 60 seconds to provide you with the practical details. Leonid Volkov will have an opening speech, whereafter Karen Anna Eggen will share her initial thoughts. Following the introductions, we will open for questions and comments. I will lead the conversation. And we also have time for a couple of questions from the audience. We have a microphone, which my colleague will carry around, or we have a cabled microphone, so I'll make sure that you know where it is. And if you want the floor, just give me a sign and I'll put you on the speakers list. I need to emphasize, as we always did before the pandemic, that we're opening up for questions or short comments, not additional speeches. So be brief. We will finish this meeting no later than 9 o'clock. My final point. We urge you to share your thoughts on today's topic on social media, and the hashtag is CivitaFrokost. You can also provide questions or comments through social media. And for the audience, remember to turn your mobile phone on a silent mode. Well, so much for the practicalities. It's my great pleasure to introduce you, Mr. Volkov. The floor is yours.
Good morning. My great pleasure and honor to be here today. Feel a little bit unusual, like for the first time after a really long break to talk to a real audience. I believe it might be one of the first experiences of the kind for you. Otherwise, I couldn't explain such an impressive turnout 8 a.m. on Monday. But the most interesting part of such conversation is always questions and answers, because I have to assume that the audience is very diverse and people would have very different knowledge about like Russian politics and what's going on and where it goes. So questions normally help to figure out like what's the audience is interested about. So I'll try to keep my introduction like very short, just to ensure to bring everyone like on the same page with the current situation, so that we could have the Q&A session as useful and practical as possible. So, and I apologize for those of you who perfectly knows what I'll be telling in the next few minutes about where we are. Alexey Navalny founded the Anti-Corruption Foundation back in 2011. We've worked together since that time. I've been his chief of staff and campaign manager for his mayoral campaign in Moscow in 2013, when he finished second. After that, Kremlin never did this mistake again, and he was never, ever again admitted to be on the ballot. We tried to get him on the ballot for the presidential election, 2018. We have launched a large campaign which lasted for a year and a half, like a real grassroots outreach campaign, when we launched 85 regional offices all over the country, Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, Murmansk to Krasnodar. Alexey Navalny was never allowed to be on the ballot to challenge President Putin in election, but we managed really to enlarge the number of our supporters and to reach out, to bring political life to Russian regions for the first time in many, many years. So we managed to prove that actually there is a lot of appetite for independent politics, not only in Moscow, but all over the country. After the presidential election, or after Putin was re-elected, we could hardly call it an election proper, of course. We continued to operate on a national scale. We kept our regional network up and running, so not only the Anti-Corruption Foundation in Moscow was investigating corruption cases among high-profile Russian officials, but also our regional offices became local hubs for investigations, for local activism, for local elections, and so on. As we anticipated the situations that will never be on the ballot again, we came up with a strategy called smart voting at the end of 2018, which suggested that from now and up, in every election, in every single mandate constituency, we will pick the candidate who has the best chances to defeat the incumbent United Russia candidate. No matter what their political affiliation, no matter what their background and views, only criteria was important. We had to select and to endorse the second most potent candidate. So that was the only criteria. To bring more diversity into regional parliaments and the federal parliament, to make sure that there is at least some level of political competition. Russia has elections always the second Sunday of September, third Sunday of September sometimes. So we first applied our smart voting strategy in September 2019, most notably for the Moscow City Council elections, which is the second most important parliament in the country, when we suddenly nearly managed to achieve the majority. 20 of the 45 seats in the Moscow City Council were won by the candidates endorsed by the smart voting and not by United Russia candidates. Quite a major upset for them. And since then, Moscow City Council became actually a very competitive place, which it never has been before. Altogether, we endorsed about 800 candidates over the country, and 160 of them actually won seats. So we brought 160 young, not so young, different politicians into real political life, into political competition. So it was our way, as the largest political force in the country, largest independent political force in the country, to influence the politics in an indirect way, despite the fact that our political party was never registered. We filed to the Russian Ministry of Justice 9 times and always were rejected for some ridiculous reasons. Still, well, we operated like a political party with regional offices all over the country and participating in elections in such a way. 2020 had to see the second edition of the smart voting, but very dramatic events preceded. On August 20th, 2020, Alexey Navalny has been poisoned with a Novichok chemical nerve agent on the campaign trail. So he was not on a vacation, not on a leisure trip, but he was on a campaign travel actually promoting smart voting candidates in Siberian cities of Novosibirsk and Tomsk 3 weeks before the election. So it was very clearly a political murder attempt. What followed next? Well, the world knows. He managed to survive. He recovered in Germany. It took him several months. Meanwhile, the second edition of smart voting was once again successful. We managed to win majority of seats in several regional councils, most notably in Tomsk and Novosibirsk municipal assemblies and Tambov municipal assembly. So once again, being able to prove that actually, despite the fact that our candidates are not on the ballot, we are strong and influential, and we achieve the results which one could expect from the second largest political force in the country. So in every election since 2019, our candidates take approximately 15 to 20% of the seats and approximately 60% of the second places, which pretty much corresponds to what one should expect from the second political force. So I'm making this point because in the West, many are calling us like dissidents, which is, of course, a honorable description, but not exactly what we are. Because, well, when we talk about dissidents, we consider like such soul brave freedom fighter who stand alone among the huge majority of the like pro-government or silent majority of pro-government people. That's not our case. We are a large popular movement. We started with like around 50,000 supporters back in 2011 when we started the Anti-Corruption Foundation. Our daily audience is now between 8 and 10 million people, which is comparable to the daily like TV audience of 20 million people in Russia. So pretty much like 20 million people like follow political news on TV, being like direct victims of Putin's propaganda machine. But like almost half of that number like are in daily contact with us, following us on our YouTube channel, on our mailing list, our application, our Instagram, our social media, and we feel it also in electoral outcomes. So we actually like have hundreds of thousands of supporters in every large Russian regions. Our movement always was able to run on donations crowdfunded from Russian voters. And, well, we used to be like a large political organization with like 300 to 400 salaried employees in the beginning of 2021, all over the Russia in our regional offices, and dozens of thousands of volunteers. Only that Putin didn't really like it, and after his attempt to silence our movement, just killing Alexey Navalny, when he failed, they decided like to come up with a real crackdown against our political structure. In April this year, Moscow City Prosecutor's Office filed to the ministry, to the court to designate our organization an extremist organization, which technically means that everyone associated with our political structure, anyone affiliated, could face up to 10 years in prison if he or she continues to be like member of the political organization. So we had to formally dissolve it just to put people out of risk. If this were not enough, they have passed a funny law in June which banned everyone ever from participation in any election who in some way was associated or supported the extremist organization. So they have stripped of right to be on the ballot, of right to be elected, like hundreds of thousands of people who supported us publicly, who donated to us, and so on, and they did it retrospectively. So people who did like nothing wrong in 2020, who perfectly legally like donated to our political organizations through Russian banks, suddenly found themselves being not allowed to be on the ballot even for the village council because they were now like associated with extremists. It's probably the most ridiculous legal action that Russian authorities have ever taken. Well, the second most ridiculous after Novichok, of course. So, and of course, this was all not done just like as an act of revenge to Alexey Navalny for he dared to survive, he dared to return to Russia, he dared to investigate Putin's corruption. No, it was also quite a strategic move because this year Russia had a parliamentary election, so after 2 years of regional and municipal elections, we were first time to apply the smart voting for the national election when the State Duma has been elected September 19th this year. Instead of that, we had to disassemble and to reassemble our political organization somewhere else. It was too dangerous for us to continue operations inside the country, so we managed to relocate the core of our organization to a safer place, to continue running anti-corruption investigations, to continue running the smart voting and our political and other political projects and initiatives that we have. And even under these circumstances, we managed to mobilize millions of people to participate in the smart voting for the Duma election and for the regional elections that also took place in September. So I want to stress that despite the fact that our organization is now banned from political operations inside the country, we are still active, we are still doing what we were doing, and actually we even want to launch a few new projects. Our strategic goal, so to say, is to make Putin regret at the end of the day that he pushed us out of the country, and I believe it's achievable. For instance, we could never afford ourselves to have a large studio for video production back there in Moscow, because every second month some funny people with search warrants would come and seize all the equipment, pretending this to be evidence for some new criminal case. I have 7 on so I'm a real criminal, charged with 7 criminal cases. They open up a new one every time they need a legal reason to come with a search warrant and to confiscate new cameras or iPhones or iPads or whatever. So now, being based not in Moscow, we actually could afford to enlarge the scale of our video production to run much more anti-corruption investigations and to do a lot of new things. We are thinking about political news program and many other projects for our audience on the internet, to counter the propaganda and to reach out to new supporters. So we, in general, we stay quite optimistic about the future of Russia and the future of our political movement. We are in touch with Alexey through the lawyers. They are allowed to visit him, and we are able to exchange information. So he's perfectly aware of what's going on. His health condition is stable. This is absence of bad news is good news under the current circumstances, and he actually guides us through this through this political season, so to say. We think that political life in Russia could always cause a bit of depression if you zoom into small detail. New criminal case, another new criminal case. This guy arrested, this guy beaten, this guy harassed. It consists of very many local bad news. And it's very good if you zoom out a little bit. So as I already told, we started with 50,000 supporters 10 years ago. We now have 10 million, which is a Tesla and Bitcoin comparable pace of growth. And it continues because actually we are able to reach a new audience, and things are getting worse for Putin. Fundamental factors, long-term fundamental factors, we consider all of them to be in our favor. I would say that there are 3 most important factors that define, and this will be my final point, there are 3 most important factors that define mid-term of Russian political future. This is first Putin himself. He's there for 22 years. People are very tired. This is very natural. Everyone under the age of 35 has never seen anything but Putin. And it's in human nature, some desire for change. And there is nothing they could do with this fundamental factor, because, well, Putin is not going to leave, of course, and so this factor will impact the political atmosphere in the country very much. This tiredness will grow. Then the second factor is economy, of course, and it's bad. The average household income is in decline for 8 years in a row now. It's not going to be better because they want to steal more than they produce. The extent of Russian corruption is enormous. You can't imagine it. The average, like the generally accepted rate of kickback for state procurement has grown from 5% to around 70% over the last 15 years. So, like, over 2/3 of federal money spent for like construction of roads, bridges, schools, hospitals are being stolen, and then they appear in another Pandora paper, so somewhere else. And this is too much of a burden, even for such a rich country as Russia is. And the third factor is, yes, corruption itself. The Anti-Corruption Foundation, founded by Alexey Navalny, continues its operation. But technically, it existed 2011 to 2021. So this year, we formally dissolved it. So what is the one single most important thing that has to be written on its gravestone? It's education. Because actually what change have all our anti-corruption investigations, including Putin's Palace and other not so famous, achieved over this course of 10 years? It's a tectonic change of Russians' attitude towards corruption. Only 15 to 17% of Russian voters considered corruption to be the major issue back in 2011. And over 60% consider it now. And there is nothing Putin could do to address this issue. So it will, because corruption is a cornerstone of the system he has built. So he can't get rid of corruption. So it was also always influence the impact of, it was always influence the image of Kremlin, of Putin's political party, of himself. His approval rating is going down. Navalny is doing better, despite he is not on the ballot, he is in prison, and still Navalny is doing better in the polls than Putin among voters under 35. So this is also another very positive trend, of course, for us. Putin is clearly below 50% for the first time in his 22 years of rule. And this election, despite all the voter fraud and despite ballot stuffing, and well, of course, it was not a real election, some electoral type procedure, still clearly indicated that for the first time, Putin and United Russia are now a minority power, and the majority of Russian voters are clearly against them. This is a new and quite unpleasant political reality for them. And as we are moving into political season of 2024 with a transitional presidential re-election, will it be a transition from Putin to someone else or from Putin to Putin, doesn't matter. It still will be a huge stress because the political system goes from under their control. So, zooming out a little bit from the local technicalities of political life in Russia, we remain quite optimistic, and of course we are going to continue doing what we are doing, and I'm sorry I took too much time, but I'll use the time during the Q&A session to go into more details about what we are doing and what's next.
Thank you so much, Leonid. It's impressive to be optimistic when you watch Russia. Kanana, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Eirik, and thank you for this optimistic and highly educational presentation. I actually recently listened to a podcast where you were quoted, Leonid, saying that the Kremlin attempts to cement or asphalt all of Russian politics, yet various flowers bloom. And I thought that was such a great quote to begin my presentation, which will very briefly touch upon the state of Russian democracy today and Russian politics. I do apologize if there's some overlap with what you just said, and some nuances will, of course, disappear when you have such a short amount of time to engage in such a complex issue as Russian politics. But I'll begin by saying that Russia today is not a democracy. The system and its institutions work towards ensuring the current regime and that the current regime survives indefinitely if they get their will. And this is most surely at the expense of alternative political voices and the political opposition. And although this year's election in many ways is a continuation of a long trend in Russian contemporary politics, it also stands out, I'd say, in the sense that Russia took a significant step in a more authoritarian and a more oppressive direction. The Kremlin, as Leonid mentioned, resecured its constitutional majority, paving the way and making it easier for President Putin in the 2024 presidential election. And I think during these parliamentary elections, the authorities were quite keen on avoiding any type of scandal, avoiding that the opposition gained too much power, and you had these big demonstrations, as you saw in 2011, 2012, and afterwards. And I would say they quite successfully managed to achieve this goal. If not, I mean, like we just heard, there are much optimism also among Russia's non-systemic opposition, but there still was a significant amount of dismantling, and the election fraud was also on a large scale, and independent journalists and media outlets, especially online platforms, were targeted extra hard during these elections. And in addition to an increase and a harsher treatment by methods we already know, this election was also quite interesting as it introduced, a new electoral rules. So you had you vote over 3 days now instead of just one, and electronic voting was also introduced, which by many was seen as yet another way to make sure that, for the authorities, to make sure that they could fabricate and falsify votes. And as we've seen, you have more inside knowledge in these graphs, but Sergei Shvilkin provided some excellent numbers on how this was done in practice. And another interesting turn is that the Russian government was actually able to pressure big internet companies such as Apple, Google, Telegram into removing oppositional platforms and applications, making it significantly harder for the Navalny-led Smart Vote campaign and for people to access information about what candidates to rally behind. And in addition, these platforms saw several cyber attacks aimed at them. So, I mean, being a bit more pessimistic than Leonid, in the near future, I don't see necessarily that it will get any better. And this has to do with the socio-economic situation getting worse, and the United Russia losing, and even Putin losing popular support, and fewer people going out to vote because they believe that elections are predetermined. And these are numbers that the Kremlin do not like to see, because they're interested in at least pretending that there's some legitimacy at play as far as popular support goes. And also, these numbers have symbolic meaning for Putin, who wished to represent himself as a strong and forceful and popular leader. So as more and more people, turn towards organizations such as Navalny's and lose hope in or stop believing in the political options that are presented by Putin and his regime, harder and more draconic measures will most likely have to be put in place in order to ensure that the regime survives. And this is where I'll just briefly turn to Alexey Navalny, who was deemed dangerous by the Russian government. And as Leonid pointed out, like you had this organization that was able to move beyond the Moscow elites, beyond the big cities, and put up Team Navalny headquarters all across Russia. And you had a significant political figure telling people that, not only can change be implemented, but it can actually be for the better. And that's why you had to clamp down so hard on Navalny and his campaign. And I would say that what we saw in these elections, although it's a continuation of a trend, it also marks a shift, I'd say, in the lengths to which the Russian government is willing to go in order to achieve the results they want. And I'm moving towards the end of my brief talk, but I think the key problem for the non-systemic opposition is like going forward, how do you move in such a coercive environment, and how do you move around the administrative, electoral, legislative hurdles, which, at least in the short term, only probably will get worse, and how do you engage Russians? And to leave on a semi-optimistic note as well, I believe engagement in many forms and shapes. The younger generation, the post-Soviet generation, they're definitely Generation Putin, but they are also Generation Navalny. Many people voted for the first time during the 2011-2012 elections. And to return to the quote, flowers do continue to bloom. We just don't know where they'll pop up and how much sun they'll get moving forward. So I'll leave on that note. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for bringing some context. And I'll just lead the conversation, and we'll open up for questions just in a while. But just let me start by asking you, Leonid, I mean, anti-corruption has been like the cornerstone of Alexey Navalny, but seen from the West, what is Navalny's policy, and what is in favor of, to the extent that it makes sense to compare him to like a Western-style democracy, as in center-left, hard left, center-right, or how would you describe him?
Yeah,
in favor of low taxes,
yes,
more healthcare, or
it's a very popular question, and it's a very popular and wrong optic to consider Russian politics through the means of like Western politics. We describe our movement as pro-European, and people here start to ask, but what does it mean pro-European? Norway and Greece, Hungary and Portugal, they are so much different. Different? Well, this depends on the viewpoint, on where you stand to consider this difference. Imagine you are on planet Venus, plus 230 degrees, and an atmosphere which consists of toxic acid. The only thing you want to do is to get on Earth. And from that perspective, there is so non-existent the difference between Norway and Afghanistan. I mean, if you get on Earth, then you'll somehow navigate. They have vehicles, planes and cars and wherever to move there. But from Venus, you have first to get there just to save yourself. That's where we are. European politics is this, plane, left to right, conservative to liberal. And people have tools to navigate this plane. If you want to have like progressive or flat income tax rate, how large should be healthcare expenditures. The tools to navigate this plane are free and fair elections, independent courts, free media, political competitions, etc., etc. Everything that Russia lacks. So when we talk about like pro-European policy and pro-European orientation of our movement, it's like now we are somewhere there. This is the European political plane, from our viewpoint, it converts to a dot. We need to move there to land on this plane, which means to create institutions to navigate it, and then to let Russian voters decide. Because now Russian voters don't have tools to have a discussion about tax rate, healthcare expenditures, LGBT rights, or migration policy. They just don't have tools for that. And to create those tools, to create those institutions, is actually the core idea of our movement. And it very much coincides with the anti-corruption fight, because such a nation-scale corruption, and this is probably also one most important lesson from 10 years of our political operations in Russia, something that we have revealed. Such a large-scale, country-scale corruption, not like some petty bribes with some local people, but when corruption has been converted to a system, when everyone has to bribe everyone in order to get something, leads to massive violation of human rights. Because to be able to exercise corruption to that extent, they have to kill competitive elections, because otherwise they will not get elected. They have to kill independent courts, because otherwise they will be challenged in courts. They have to kill free press, because otherwise press will investigate their corruption. So Putin has built a system that runs completely on corruption, and in order to keep it up and running, he destroyed all the basic human rights. So in our terms, fighting anti-corruption is fighting pro-human rights and pro-European, pro-institutional.
Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that Alexey Navalny is considered somewhat dubious and with some suspicion in the West. Is that your impression as well? And why is the reason for this? I'll let you answer afterwards, Leonid.
There have been some debates concerning Navalny. I mean, he's a complex person like everyone else, and I'd like to begin by saying that I think his key legacy is just what Leonid was talking about, you know, fighting corruption and attempting to have free and fair elections in Russia, to name a few. Some of the critique stems from some of the more nationalistic views that he's been uttering, and particularly, I believe, like the late 2000s, there were some videos where he had some quite xenophobic comments, and I believe some of the worry has been tied to this, that he represents a very far-right view of immigrants from Central Asia, etc. But he has in recent years toned down this a lot, and he is definitely conservative when it comes to immigration policies. And he also doesn't want to refuse or apologize for some of the earlier statements that he's made. But I think it's important to remember, that it's probably, at least at the moment we are now, I wouldn't say that Navalny is a racist, or that he is, as the government has tried to portray him, a neo-Nazi or a spy for the Americans, because there are interests in Russia too, as well, in exaggerating these comments and these views. This is me not, making an excuse for them, and I would be, I think it would even be an even more interesting discussion had he not, been in jail, facing a 10-year sentence for, fighting for a more free and fair Russia. And the Navalny and his team is, facing immense pressure at the moment. The more dubious or more conflicted views concerning Navalny is tied to this more nationalistic side of him. But he he also appeals to liberals, and he has also increasingly so proposed to the more left side of Russian or of politics. So he's definitely an interesting character, but I believe at the moment the most interesting legacy is the corruption fight and his fight for and his organization's fight for a more free and fair Russia.
So, Leonid, what's your comments about this accusation about Navalny, the right-wing nationalism, etc.?
Well, first of all, this is just not true. So I know him since 2010. Well, he is a good personal friend, first of all. And I see that he is a person who studies a lot, who develops. And like his personal views also have, of course, moved a lot during the last years. And he has also a lot of appetite to learn something new, to broaden his horizon, his perspective. He reads on like politics and policies much more than anyone else in our team. But I'm not going to try to acquit him or something like this, because we see that there was actually like a Kremlin promoted campaign on these 2007 like nationalistic videos, where they are put out of the context, provided with a wrong English translation, and weaponized against him. I do believe that Alexey Navalny of 2021 would not sign his name under these videos, definitely so. But it's also noteworthy to mention that they are just not interpreted correctly in the current context. So, I mean, I'm not saying these are good videos, but they are definitely not as bad as they are. In 2007, migration has been a big issue in Russia because of very fast economic growth. There was not enough workforce. Very many migrants from Central Asia came. And Kremlin, that time Kremlin's administration, Volkov first of all, saw that there is a lot of like natural xenophobic like mood among young people, among like young badly educated people in large cities who felt like, okay, these migrants are taking our jobs and so on. There was such sentiment. And Kremlin tried to make use of this sentiment. Kremlin actually created like Rodina, a far-right party, which has been led by neo-Nazis, people who were like Zig Heiling on Moscow streets. And their leader was Dmitry Rogozin, who was then deputy prime minister and who is now the head of Roscosmos, the Russian NASA, the Russian agencies. And there is a lot of videos of him like really marching in Moscow with a Nazi salute. And this was Kremlin funded. So, because they wanted to kind of use this energy of this like young people who didn't like those migrants and so on. And Navalny's videos were, he had like more like nationalist, definitely more nationalist views than he has now. But those videos, he addresses that audience, explaining actually that the enemy sits in Kremlin, not in Central Asia, and the policies that Kremlin suggests in fighting migrants or like is not correct. So he was trying to, not successfully, unfortunately, but he was trying to compete with the like Kremlin-backed parties for their influence on these young people. That was the context. So, and it's quite ironical and cynical that now Kremlin is trying to weaponize this, to use this video in a large and well-funded campaign to undermine his credibility in the West, citing his views of 2007. So, once again, not that I'm in agreement with what he's saying in that video, but context is also quite important. But the most important thing is that, once again, we are able, and we have proven that we are able for a lot of evolution. We are very pluralistic, actually, in our organization. We had, for instance, like in the pastimes of the Anti-Corruption Foundation, when we all were still occupying our office in Moscow and not working virtually and from different places, we had, for instance, an internal debate competition where we were having debates on different issues, and that's okay within our organization also not to be in agreement on all positions. For instance, Navalny is pro-gun rights, and I'm, for instance, very much against that. And there are some other positions too. And that's okay. I believe that we managed to build such a political environment where really people with quite different views are able to work together against the much bigger and much more important enemy. As we discussed before, to build the institutions that will us let to have proper political debate. Maybe in this metaphoric, beautiful Russia of the future, me, for instance, and Navalny or some other colleagues will belong to different political parties, and that's okay.
We will soon move on to the audience. I have a colleague, Therese, who will organize the cable microphone. We'll see how we do this practically. But before I open the floor, and you're all welcome to sign up if you want to take the floor, I just want to ask Karen and then Leonid about the West's role here. How should we engage Putin's Russia? How can we promote democracy to the extent that is what we want to do? What would be your take, Karen?
Yeah, I'd be actually more interested in hearing Leonid's take on this. We had a brief discussion about this earlier. I mean, there's no secret that politics in Russia is hard at the moment, but of course there are several things that the West can do and already is doing, and that is, being firm in what you expect from countries as far as, democracy promotion goes. You can support oppositional candidates. You can take, tougher stance on Russia. Politicians can, use backdoor channels or public channels to engage with or confront the current political regime. So, I mean, there are several things that can be done. I personally think it's a very difficult question, but that doesn't mean, you shouldn't, have the debate. But yeah, I think I'll leave the floor to you, Leonid, because you have a more prepared answer to that question.
It was actually, it's also a very common question, and it was always quite a hard question for me because, for instance, we don't need money, for instance. We are very successful in crowdfunding. We have hundreds of thousands of supporters who send us an average of 500 rubles, so €6 per month, but there are thousands of them, and our organization is running well on these micro donations, and we don't want to be dependent on some foreign sources. We don't need any advice on how, Americans love to do educational seminars on how to run local elections. I'm sorry, but we better know how to run local elections in Russia, and so on and so on. So it has been a challenging question, but now I feel I have the answer, and even three of them. First point, personal sanctions. This is the most important major finding of the famous Navalny's Putin Palace investigation. We knew that Putin has this palace, actually. That it was nothing new was revealed. But still, it was a sensation, 120 million views on YouTube, and everyone was discussing it. Why? Because it has been a powerful insight into Putin's brain, into Putin's head, into his background. And we've discovered a very small man, first of all. The guy had an opportunity to do whatever he wants. He had 20 years of unlimited power in the richest country of the world. He could build the best university, he could fly to Mars, he could build the best network of paved roads, whatever. He has chosen to build an enormous palace of gold and red carpets. And this says so much about him personally. about what he is, and about how money is important for him. And that's why we are advocating, and since Navalny's return, before he returned, he has put together this list of 35 names, Putin's closest allies, his pockets, the nominal holders of his assets. You could hardly expect to find a bank account labeled Vladimir Putin. But we all perfectly know that the bank accounts labeled Timchenko, Rothenberg, Abramovich, Usmanov are actually Putin's account. And they all understand this is Putin's money, and he's probably the wealthiest man in the world. And as money is so important for him, to gain some leverage, to be able to negotiate with him from much stronger positions, a very important precondition is finally to go after this money that has been stolen from Russian taxpayers within the last 20 years. This will change the position from which the West is now talking to Putin, because now the West is weak, and Putin always comes up as a winner from every conversation, be it with Biden or someone else. Second, about these negotiations, let me start with a brief illustration. Could you give me a pen, please?
There you go.
Thank you. This was a transaction. So I asked for a pen, then I got Karen's consent, and then the transaction followed. So she actually gave me the pen. With Putin is a bit different. We hear it from Western politicians always that we still have to negotiate with Russia. We still have to talk. Russia is so important. We can't get without Russia on climate change, on counterterrorism, on Arctic, and so on. As a mathematician and computer scientist by background, I feel this logic is very flawed, because we not negotiate for the purpose of negotiation. We negotiate to reach some agreement that then will be actually enabled. We not only want to discuss the transfer of the pen, but we also expect that it will be actually transferred. But with Putin, it's not the case. The guy has an enormous proven track record of not acting upon his obligations. Russia has obligations with regard to chemical weapons non-proliferation. Russia is a founder member of the OPCW, and yet Russia develops new chemical weapons and applies them. Russia is a member of the Council of Europe and has obligation towards human rights, and Russia disrespects all the Council of Europe, European Court of Human Rights ruling with regard to Navalny and many others. Russia is a signatory of Minsk agreements on Donbass and Ukraine, and Russia just doesn't act upon its international obligations. So what is the logic, as it is quoted that Albert Einstein said, yes, in this famous quote, what is the logic of doing the same again and again and expect to get a different result, different outcome? So what is the logic to try to enter new agreements with Putin when we know perfectly that he just doesn't do what he promises to do many times? And this also could be used as a powerful tool actually to impose some pressure on him, because he needs to be part of international relations. He needs to be part of these agreements and negotiations. Putin has built probably the most efficient propaganda machine in the world. Like really, he could explain to his domestic audience whatever he wants. But even the best propaganda machine, even the best machine needs fuel to run on. And there are no good domestic news he could sell. So he sells the past, the victory, Gagarin's flight to cosmos, or most recently, Alexander Nevsky's defeat of Teutonen warlords in the beginning of the 13th century, when he inaugurated like another huge monumental memorial of this. And he needs foreign policy success. It's very vital for his propaganda to be able to show this picture, Putin in the room where it happened, shaking hands with important world leaders, signing some new agreements. So he needs it desperately, and this creates a lot of leverage for the West. And it's very clear approach that new agreements with Putin should be entered only after he acts upon his existing obligations. Investigates the poisoning, implements the Minsk agreements, releases political prisoners upon the orders of the European Court of Human Rights, and so on. And the third point, the last one, but the most important and the most recent one, tech platforms. I was talking a lot about how stronger we managed to get in the last few years, but we also completely depend on the tech platforms. So all our activities will become obsolete now with the absence of our physical presence in Russian cities if we get deplatformed, if we get banned on Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on. And as Karen put it, remember, it's actually what was happening in the recent weeks. Russian government imposed more pressure on the platforms, and somehow they managed to persuade Google and Apple to start censoring our content online, which is, of course, a blatant violation of human rights and also like a very bad signal for anyone, not only in Russia, but in Iran and Turkey and China and wherever in the world. That's big tech companies putting so-called legal compliance ahead of human rights is like a very bad story, and that's something where, well, the West should and could intervene.
I didn't notice anyone coming on the speakers list, and we're moving towards the end, so I think I'll just have to give a couple of final comments to Karen and Leonid. And Karen, let me end by asking you, where do you see the Russian government going forward? How strong is Putin in your view? Is there any hope for any immediate change in the short run?
So I think Leonid was kind of touching upon this because when you see polls on Putin's popularity, you
Can
have...
you trust polls in Russia?
To some extent.
And some you can...
We have our in-house, okay, because we can't probably...
No, but I mean, you know, Putin does enjoy a high, relatively high approval rating. But when you look at trust numbers, they are usually half of what the approval ratings are, you know, and they are about 60%. And in order to understand that, you have to understand, you know, what people see when they see Putin. And on the one hand, he's this icon, he's this representation of Russia, he's this great, you know, leader who took Russia out of the chaotic 90s. And he's, for many Russians, what they tie to Russian politics. And that's where you see the high approval ratings. But then you go to Putin, the politician, and the politics he represents. And that's where you see the lower trust ratings, because people are experiencing a worsening economy. And quite frankly, many Russians want something new. It doesn't mean that they hate Putin, but they haven't seen anything else, and they're interested in change. So I guess that's an explanation to, you know, Putin and how popular he is. But like I said in my introduction, at least not in the near future. I think there will be great changes, but you have people like Leonid, like Navalny and his campaign, who's working tirelessly to implement change, who have ideas, who have visions about like how do we get to a point where we reach, you know, your goals for Russia. And that makes me hopeful, at least. But in the near future, I don't necessarily see these, you know, big changes happening.
Yeah, a final comment, Leonid, and what do you think about the future for Navalny?
There was a question.
I think we're running out of time, just so you can take it after.
Okay, so the future for Navalny is good, but it depends very much of the international attention, of course. So a year ago, they didn't try just to kill him. They tried to kill him covertly. So they didn't order someone to shoot him in his forehead. The idea was that the plane lands, there is a dead body, and every doctor in their good face says it was a heart attack. So Putin clearly wanted not to be associated with that. Not everything has run according to his plan, and it's a very important takeaway. Putin could plan many things, but he fails sometimes. But to some extent, this protects Alexei now, because, well, the world knows that he is actually in Putin's custody, and of course, Putin has to be blamed for anything bad that could happen. So and Putin will be responsible. But if he gets forgotten, if the focus of international attention goes away, then he will be at risk, of course. Russian prison is not the best possible place. And we actually believe that like the international advocacy campaign for his release could use the tools that I mentioned. So personal sanctions, not letting Putin into important meetings until he acts upon his existing obligations and so on. There is a lot of leverage that could be built against Putin, and first of all, in order to get political prisoners, including Alexey Navalny, released. Russia has now the largest number of political prisoners since Stalin time. So Gorbachev and Khrushchev and Brezhnev and even Andropov didn't have as many as Putin has now. It's quite a dramatic situation to have in the 21st century in Europe, and it requires strong measures and strong interventions.
Before we end and give the panelists a warm applause, just let me say that it was great to see physical present audience again. I hope we can have a lot of these events going forward. Let me also remind everyone that we have another cooperation with the Oslo Freedom Forum at 12 o'clock, the case of Hong Kong and freedom of speech. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank to the panelists. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.